Okay, here we are, the last video in Unit 4 for Political Organization of Space, and today we're talking about devolution. So devolution is a word that on the AP exam in 2019, there was a question about how Spain and Nigeria were feeling devolutionary forces. And the first part of the essay, and I've told you guys so many times, almost all of these FRQs, they start off with that first command verb being to define. And so what they wanted students to be able to do was to define what devolution means. So devolution is whenever the central government is losing power. So you know that we have some countries that are unitary systems of government, some are federal. And remember, it has nothing at all to do with whether they're democratic, whether they're authoritarian, whether they're monarchy, or whether they're a dictatorship. The reality is there more than one layer of government within the country? So in a devolutionary sense, when you have a federal system, there is some devolution automatically because the central government does not have all of the power. Some power is placed within the power of the regional governments. In this country, we call those states, of course. Remember, we talked about why we are the United States of America. Canada calls them provinces. Different countries may refer to them in different ways. But when you're a federal system of government, you're going to be giving some power to the regional level of government. In a unitary system, remember, you only have that one level of government for the whole country. And that usually works great if you have a small, culturally homogeneous, kind of a compact type state. Unitary works really well because, you can get things done quickly and everybody's pretty much on the same page anyway. So when you think about devolution, sometimes in a unitary system, like in Spain, you can have some parts of the country that feel different, feel like they're kind of left out maybe economically, feel like they're out there on the periphery of the country. Maybe they're up in the mountains, maybe they're on the far edges, they could be on an island, they could be out at the end of a peninsula, kind of a thing. Sometimes that physical terrain or that ethnic separatism can be these forces of devolution. In Nigeria, it could be the different religions of the groups in the north, the tribes, the tribalism that is so current in Africa and plaguing many African countries. In Spain, the Catalan people with their separate identity, with their idea of a different language, and the idea that they have a shared history, that they used to be independent and want to be independent again. So all of these things are these devolutionary pressures. And sometimes a state can choose to give these regional groups some kind of autonomy. Remember, we talked about the difference between autonomy and sovereignty, giving them a little bit of their own local decision making, their own self-control. But you have to be careful because once you give them a little taste of that, making their own decision, perhaps they want more. Perhaps they really want to break away and completely separate from the state. And this is what happened, for example, with South Sudan. It's the newest country in the world, the newest state, I should say, and they broke away from the rest of Sudan just within the last decade. Czechoslovakia, another famous example, where the Czechs and the Slovaks pretty much said, look, we never really wanted to be together anyway. This was a state that got created as a buffer after the end of World War I by taking away land that used to belong to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Czechs are different than the Slovaks. The Czechs are more urban, more industrial. Slovaks more agricultural and rural. And they basically had a vote in 1992, and they said, look, we don't want to be with you, and it's not you, it's me, and it's the velvet divorce because it was smooth. Yugoslavia, on the other hand, violent breakup. We always talk about this term Balkanization when it comes to Yugoslavia's breakup, because you had the genocide, you had the ethnic cleansing going on mostly within Bosnia and Herzegovina, but the Serbs and the Croats fighting against each other, and the poor Bosnians were kind of stuck in the middle. And within Bosnia, you had Croats living there, you had Serbs living there, you had obviously the Bosnian population, which is mostly Muslim, was living there, and that was an extreme example of this devolution ripping a country apart, and that's what we call Balkanization. So devolution does not have to result in the country breaking up. Devolution can just be, for example, Canada allowing Quebec, because they're linguistically different, to, for example, have their own sign laws. When you walk down the street in Quebec, you see that the language in the economy is French, as opposed to the rest of Canada being English. Devolution, in its extreme case, can create the failed state, can break the state apart. But mostly, devolution is just going to be the central government yielding some degree of power to the different regional component parts of the state. And again, in a federal system, that is exactly the design of federalism, is devolutionary, to give the regional level of government some power, some say in what's going on. So in today's world, you're going to see devolution really two basic ways. Either devolution that's coming from inside the group that wants more autonomy, wants independence, wants to break away. These are usually peripheral places. Scotland, they've had a referendum. Do they want to leave the UK? Catalonia from Spain, they've had a referendum. Do they want to break away? Interestingly, in that case, Spain was like, well, that vote's not really valid anyway. The Quebecois, right? We just mentioned Quebec. They've had a referendum in recent decades about whether or not to stay part of the federal system in Canada. We all know the situation going on with the Kurds in Syria and Iraq. The Basque people, who, it's big misnomer. Everybody thinks the Basque people only live in Spain. They live in France too. They live on both sides of the Pyrenees Mountains, and they're up in the mountains, and they're very peripheral. And so they often think that, why don't we just become our own country? We don't want to be Spanish. We don't want to be French. They have their own unique identity. They have their own unique language. The Igbo of Nigeria. Uyghurs in China, if you want to look that one up, that's a great one to search up. These are ethnically Chinese Muslims in the western part of China. And in the news lately, there have been these, exposés about how China is using kind of camps to round up, and almost like concentration camps, to keep these Uyghurs in a detention type of a state. The Rohingya, we've talked about them in class before. These are the ethnic group that's in Myanmar and is fleeing from the violence there and heading over into Bangladesh. They are Muslim, but they are not Bengali or Bangla, so Bangladesh doesn't really want them. Myanmar doesn't want them. They're kind of like a stateless group of people. So when you think about all of this ethno-nationalism, this is the separatism where these people want their own state, or at least some elements within these populations. Not everybody in Scotland wants Scotland to break away. Not everybody in the Basque region wants independence. But the majority of the people in these groups have advocated for their own separate sovereignty. The other kind of devolution that can happen is not an internal force, it's an external issue where your neighbor, a country next door, is trying to annex, trying to occupy, trying to take away land from your state and add it to their state. And so what we're seeing now is a good example of this with Crimea, where Russia, Putin has become very territorially aggressive, saying that those parts of Ukraine are ethnically made up of Russians. The people who live there are not Ukrainian. They don't want to be part of Ukraine. And so he's using that as a pretext or an excuse to say, well, that really shouldn't be Ukraine territory anyway. It's not Ukrainian people. So we're going to come in, we're going to physically take that and make it part of Russia. Of course, historically, it had been part of the Russian Empire. It was under Soviet control when the Soviet Union included Ukraine. Apple, by the way, just this week announced that they were, re-evaluating their mapping software system because on Apple Maps, it showed Crimea as being part of Russia. And of course, that created kind of an issue with the Ukrainian government, with people of Ukrainian heritage. How can you possibly say that that's part of Russia? That's, Ukraine's sovereign territory. They've stolen it from us. They've taken it from us. But that's what irredentum is. And don't forget, when we think about the United States history, we've practiced some irredentism before. You think about Texas. Texas was part of Mexico, legitimately Mexican territory. A lot of Americans had moved into the area. They were having a grievance with the Mexican government. And being Americans, they kind of turned to the United States and said, hey, why don't you help us out here? Texas had their own rebellion for a short time. Remember, Texas was its own sovereign state, the Lone Star Republic. Republic. And, basically the United States, supported that revolution against the Mexican government of Santa Anna. Remember the Alamo? And of course, fun fact, many Tennesseans volunteered to go to the Alamo, including Davy Crockett. They died at the Alamo, and the United States government, ultimately, about a decade later, annexed Texas, and then it, of course, became a U.S. state. So, that's irredentist. That's the United States from the outside taking away territory from Mexico because of the, legitimacy of saying, well, the people who live there are Americans anyway. They don't want to be Mexican. They don't want to be part of Mexico. And so we're just going to come in and we're going to take that territory away. Same thing happened, of course, with the breakup of Yugoslavia, where Serbia was saying, hey, inside Bosnia, inside Croatia, there are ethnic Serb people living there. They're getting picked on. They're getting persecuted. We have to go in and defend them because they are our brothers. They're our ethnic Serb cousins, and we have to go in and protect them. And we want that territory to be part of Serbia. So those are the two basic types of devolution that you'll see. Now, when we show you this map, really important that we go back to that idea that almost every one of these devolutionary areas within European countries today are at the extreme periphery of a lot of these locations. They're out on islands. They're in the mountains. They're way up at the end of elongated states. They're out onto corrupted peninsula areas. And all of these are good examples of places that recently, this is kind of within the last decade or so, there have been some devolutionary issues. And remember, this could be cultural. Remember, we talked about in Belgium, there's no such thing as Belgian in that sense linguistically, because you have Flemings, you have Walloons. The Walloons speak French, the Flemings speak Dutch. This area of South Tyrol, this is a German-speaking area of Italy. The people who live there, they dress like Germans. They, play oompa band music, and they eat sausages, and, it's a very German kind of a culture, but they are Italians. But there's some movement within that area to say, look, let's just carve out our own little country here. Corsica being part of France. Remember, that's where Napoleon was born. He wasn't really French. He was Corsican, Italian family heritage. Sardinia, today part of Italy. And Sardinia, remember, it was the kingdom of Sardinia, and the king of Sardinia became the king of Italy when they created their monarchy. Northern Cyprus, that was taken over in 1974 by the Turkish army, and Turkey now declares that there is a Republic of Northern Cyprus. No other country in the world recognizes Northern Cyprus except, Turkey, who basically created it. The Greeks don't recognize it. The Cypriots don't recognize it. The British don't recognize it, and Britain colonized Cyprus and left in the 1960s. There's still a big British air base there. But these are examples of places. Look at Kaliningrad. This is that exclave, that piece of Russia that doesn't touch the rest of Russia. And there are some people within Kaliningrad that say, hey, why don't we just create our own country? Let's just be Kaliningrad. We don't need to be part of Russia anymore. So all of these are good examples of these devolutionary pressures. What else can cause devolution? We talked about, the central government is losing power. So being peripheral, that's a big thing. The shape of your state. If you're fragmented, if you live in an archipelago, the Philippines, the islands that are farthest away from the capital in Manila are going to be most likely to be feeling these devolutionary pressures. The same thing happened recently in Indonesia, where East Timor, or Timor-Leste in French, decided that they didn't want to be part of Indonesia anymore. They fought a long and a violent fighting campaign where, international troops had to come in and mediate and moderate and keep the peace. But Timor-Leste was successful in breaking away from the rest of Indonesia. This is kind of like, with example, Puerto Rico, wanting to have independence. And in Puerto Rico, there's really three big political parties, in the sense that there's one party that wants to maintain the the status quo and keep their Commonwealth status. There's one political party that is pushing for independence, and there's one party in Puerto Rico that wants them to become a U.S. state. And they say, we want to be the 51st U.S. state. But there's still devolutionary pressure there. Even within Hawaii, there are those indigenous groups in Hawaii that say, hey, we'd be better off if we break away from the United States. And you always have to remember, what's the economic impact of that if they became their own state? In the case of Hawaii, even though they're so remote, and even though they're so far away and out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, surely tourism would bring in enough money for Hawaii to be able to economically support itself. Puerto Rico, perhaps the same way. A lot of cruises that dock in San Juan, a lot of people that spend time in Puerto Rico when it's cold in the United States. And of course, the fact that you go to Puerto Rico, you don't need a passport because it's part of the United States. States that lag between different power cores, these gateway states or buffer states that sometimes happen. People have always talked about Turkey being a possible bridge between a European Union and the Islamic world of the Middle East. Turkey is Muslim, but they're very Western in their economy, much more modernized, much more urbanized, and much more developed than the rest of the Middle East in that sense. Or it could be a shatter belt situation where two core areas have had conflict against each other, and the territory lying between it is broken up in a sense of a shatter belt. And you can certainly see that along, for example, India, Pakistan with the region of Kashmir. You can see that as you go through Eastern Europe between the old Soviet Union and the old NATO, countries like Hungary, countries like Poland, countries like Romania, Moldova, the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Sometimes those can be described as shatter belt type areas. And sometimes that can create devolutionary pressure as well. And then, of course, economic issues. Catalonia, it's a very small part of Spain, not that many people, but it is a huge portion of Spain's economy. And so when the economy is separate, and when people feel like that they don't really want to be part of that territory anymore culturally or identity-wise, and when the economy is also split, that can be another reason for devolution. So this brings us back to the two words that we talked about a long time ago in this unit, but it goes perfectly with this idea of devolution. Are there forces that are tearing the country apart, or are there forces that are holding the country together? And the viability of the state, whether or not it stays together long term, is like any relationship. If you have more good days than bad days, you'll probably stay together. If every time you see each other, you're kind of fighting with each other, and you don't really even like each other, and you don't say nice things to each other, and you forget to do those little sweet nothings and the I love yous, well, then you're not going to stay together. And countries are no different. If you have groups of people within the state who say, well, I don't like you, and you don't like me, and we don't like each other, and why are we even still together? Let's just break up. And this is what happens, centrifugal and centripetal forces that either tear the state apart in the case of centrifugal pressures, and it's like being in a centrifuge, push that button and it splits everything up, or the centripetal forces that are going to keep it together. So as you read through here, I didn't put country names here, but you really should be able to read through each of these and say, I know an example, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in Asia, whether it's in Africa. I know examples for each of these kinds of issues that are either tearing a state apart or holding a state together. And certainly the type of government, the use of media, the government in terms of education in the United States. We all stand up, one nation, under God, indivisible, liberty and justice for all. The idea is that you're creating a sense of unity. You're creating a raison d'etre, a reason for being. Why are we Americans? What does it mean to be Nigerian? What does it mean to be Belgian? What does it mean to be Canadian? What does it mean to be British? Especially in these kinds of countries that are culturally plural, like Great Britain, the UK, like Canada, like the United States, like India, like Brazil, and many of these, of course, are federal systems because they're trying to hold the state together. So all of these are good examples. Again, moving a capital, another good example of how you can kind of keep a state together. Brazil moved their capital to Brasilia in the center of the state. Same thing happened in Nigeria, moving it from Lagos to Abuja because they wanted to create a central location Devolution, hoping to keep the state together from that center point rather than splitting the state into factions, into tribal elements that don't want to be together. Okay, so that's it for Unit 4. Hopefully you're ready for your test that's coming around December 11th. MCQ progress check coming up in class. Sorry for this one being just a slight bit long, but we'll try and keep it at under 20 minutes so that you hopefully don't fall asleep while you're listening to Spatial Shark. Good luck. We'll see you soon.